Hi, my name is Leah Kopke, and this is my 3D modeling podcast, Ambient 3D Animations. We've gone ahead and 3D modeled a hand and a bookcase, so this bookcase needs some books. So here you can see what I've done so far in terms of 3D modeling some books. We are going to practice 3D modeling another one in addition to these, but I wanted to show you what I've done so far. Because the idea is if you can create one book, you can create many books. So I had taken photos of books that I have, and I UV wrapped these 3D models. So that we have some books. So these were just ones that I could find around my home. These ones I had made and just put the name of the playlists from my YouTube channel on there. So that was fun. You can make custom books, you can design them, put your own patterns on them, name them whatever you want, or you could take photos of an existing book. The nice thing about taking photos of an existing book that you have, if it has a little bit of wear and tear on it, it adds a little bit more realism to it if it isn't perfect. So if you've had it for a while and it's well loved, it'll look a little bit more realistic. And you can see that I added in the hands we 3D modeled here. So they're helping to support the books, and that's fun. And then, of course, the large statue hand back here. So this is where we're at for right now, and we're going to make a book. Let me show you which one it is. So it's this one here, Folding Techniques for Designers, From Sheet to Form. And we are going to create this. What I like to do is take measurements of the books using a tape measure. So I went ahead and did that and took dimensions of it down so that we can 3D model it and have the UV wraps look pretty close. So let's go ahead and jump into Cinema 4D. Before we start modeling, we want to check our units and our project settings and our preferences. So first we'll use the hotkey Command D or Control D, depending on if you're on a Mac or a PC. And in here under scale, you can see your project scale. You want to make sure that your project scale is in inches. And then to make sure that the units you see next to the numbers in here match the project scale, we go into Edit, Preferences, Units, and make sure that this says inches as well. I'm working in inches. If you aren't working in inches, you can work in centimeters or whatever you'd like. It doesn't matter. The next step is to drop in a cube. So this book is very cube-like shaped. So it's a nice base to start off with. And then we can enter in our dimensions of our book in here. If you are working with a hardcover book instead of a book like this, you might need to add in some extra details like that cover and UV wrap those as well. But the process is very similar, so I'm going to show it on this book here. For the X dimensions, I want these to be 8.75. Y would be 8.75. This is a square-like cover. And in the Z direction, I'll double check. It is 3/4 an inch, so 0.75 inches. And with that, we can zoom in close here, hit the C hotkey so that's editable. Once we hit the C hotkey, you'll see that we get another tag right here. We get a UVW tag. Now this will give us the ability to adjust the texture on here for the book, and I'll show you a little bit more about that soon. So what I like to do first off is I'd like to snap the axis to the corner because I find that easier to work with. when I'm placing it on a shelf. It's easier if the axis is on the bottom of the book rather than on the top of the book. So what I'll do is enable the axis and move this down. And I want this to snap to points and edges. In our settings, if you want to learn more about the snap tool, there's an episode on that. So I'll just add this to one of these corners. It doesn't really matter which one. For right now, we can move it later if we'd like to. So now that we have our axis in place, almost in place, I need to move this over a little bit more. Sometimes it's easier to check if it's in place if you use the 4 views than in perspective. Here it's a lot easier to line it up. If you hit the S key, it automatically fills your screen with the object, which is nice. So you could do that actually for each view, and it's a lot easier to see what you're modeling with. I'll turn this off and use the middle mouse button to come out of that view. Now that we've done that, I make sure that enable axis is turned off again, so this time we're moving the object instead of the axis. And I want to move this up and zero this out actually, so I'll just add in 0 for the X, Y, and Z position. So this is the basic shape of our book. Now we're going to need to adjust the UVW tag here, but we need to do that in a different mode. So I'm going to switch from standard mode to UV edit. And the screen will readjust, it'll look a little bit different. And you'll notice that if I click on one of these polygons, this lights up. So that's actually that side. And you'll notice that each one of these sides, if I use the E hotkey and move them, you'll realize that they're just overlapping each other. And if we want each of these faces to have something different on them, we're going to need to readjust this. So under the UV manager, you'll see several options here that are very helpful. So you can adjust the projection, and this will get you pretty close to having something UV wrapped. It'll lay it out for you. So if you have something spherical, you could try sphere, and it'll try to lay it out as a sphere, but you need to make sure you have all your polygons selected. If you choose cylinder, it'll create the UV map based on if it were cylindrical. Frontal, it'll just take the front view of wherever your camera is. So this one actually makes more sense if you want to grab one side and have the camera be facing that one side. If I go into the front view and have it facing this side and choose frontal, it'll create that view based on what I see from the camera view. Flat will just flatten it out like that. So I'm going to go ahead and select everything again and then press cubic. And that'll take us back to where we were before, where it was just making everything overlapping each other. Cubic 2 will lay it out as though a cube, but this time it doesn't have each surface overlapping. You can choose box, and it lays it out a little bit more proportionally than this one. Box accounts for different side dimensions and doesn't make everything a square, which is nice. Shrink is kind of like a shrink wrap, so it looks like this. I'm going to go back to box because this is actually the closest to what we need. And if you want to see what you're clicking on, like if I click on this side, you can see that's there. So maybe this will be the front. But then if this is the front, this will be the pages. So I'd actually like the front of the book. So when you open up a book, you have the spine of it, and we kind of want to lay out our UV wrap similar to this, because then we can have the sides all be pretty seamless. We don't want it to lay out a different way. So in this case, if we want this to be the front, this would be the edge of the book. Right here, the edge. So that's over there, but then we want that to connect with the back side, but the back of the book is over here. So what we can do is use the hotkey E, and this will allow us to move it over here. And if I use UF, I can also select this, and I can use E again to just move these over again into here. Now I'm going to zoom in using the middle scroll button and just get these pretty close to matching. And then if we turn on our snap, we can actually snap these 2 points together. And if you select everything, we can go ahead and use Command T, and that'll bring up these controls here, and I can actually scale it in from one side, because we want to make sure that everything is within this box, because this is where our texture will live. So that looks pretty good. And now we can go ahead and start setting this up so that we can bring it into Photoshop to add in the actual texturing, because we're going to Photoshop the images I took of this book to do so. So what we need to do is go into File, this file, and say New Texture. And you can choose the width and the height. We can do 4,000 pixels by 4,000 pixels. That's fine at 72. I'm using 16-bit. You can use whatever you'd like. This will be your background color, so we could make this white if we wanted to. And we can choose a name for our texture. So I will name this Folding Techniques. Since that's our book, I'll hit OK. And now you can see our texture in here. Now I want an outline of these polygons, so that when I bring it into Photoshop, I know where to add the textures. So if you actually click on the polygons, you can outline them, and I'll show you how to do that. So if we go into Window and we click on Layer Manager, we actually want this Layer Manager down here. There's 2 layer managers. This one is for the objects in your scene, and this one is for layers for your texture. So we actually want this one. It's a little bit confusing. So we want this layer manager, and you can see this is our background. We can turn it on and off. We can create more layers too. So if you go into this layer drop down menu, you can choose new layer. And this one we could name polygons, and these will carry over into Photoshop when we save this out. Under Window, we can also take a look at our color settings, and here we can choose what color these lines are going to be. So black will show up really well against the white, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. I'll select these polygons, choose layer, outline, polygons, and you can see that there's an outline there. Now I also need to outline these. If this is a little bit imperfect, it won't really show up, but it's good to try to get things exact. Outline polygons. I think this one looks like it's overlapping a little bit, so I actually need to move this over some more. So going to move this here. And now that should fix that seam. I'm holding Shift-C. And I want to grab this eraser here to just erase this part. Okay, so I'll grab this, and then we'll go into Layer, Outline Polygons. And another thing to be aware of is you can also find your brush in here. So we want the brush for painting textures. And in your attributes, you can see the size of the brush, and we can adjust this too. And that's what's being used to outline the polygons. So now we can go ahead and save this. So File, Save Texture. I'm going to save it as a TIFF so that it has layers, and I'll hit OK. I'll save this in here. And then I'll go ahead and open this inside of Photoshop. So here we are inside of Photoshop. I took photos of these books. I tried to use some very diffuse lighting while taking photos of these so that they don't look too reflective. These are the 3 for this book. So I'm just going to drag and drop these into my file here. We're going to do a little bit of Photoshop to get these looking right. So I don't want this background in here. I just need the back side of this book. So I can use the L hotkey, or I can grab the polygon lasso here. If you aren't seeing the polygon lasso, if you hold to click on it, you can see the other options. I'm using this one because it's easier to draw a square with it. So I'll go ahead up into this corner, click, and click in each one of these corners so that I have this center part selected. If I click on this button here, it'll inverse my selection, because what I actually want to do is erase the surrounding. So if I use the E hotkey, that'll allow us to use the eraser. Your eraser's right over here. And if I click in this area, Photoshop will say this smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Edit contents will no longer be available. Rasterize the smart object, and we'll say yes. And then you can go ahead and erase in here, or you can use the delete key in order to just remove it completely. Control D will get rid of these walking and salon gear selection, and we can then use V in order to click on this and move it. Now you can see that this isn't perfectly square, so we're going to need to adjust this further. But first, let's get this lined up to this corner here. So I'll use Control T, that would be Command D on a Mac, and that'll bring up our transform tools. I'm going to scale this in, Holding Shift, just get it pretty close. And then we can right click on this and get it even closer by selecting Distort. And now at this point, I like to zoom in really, really close and line this up as perfectly as I can to the polygons. It's better to have them overlap a little bit with that edge than not go all the way to it. If for some reason this isn't enough to get the square on here, you could even try warp. If one of the pages was bent up and you're trying to get it to look more flat, you can try warp in here, and that'll give you a grid of points to move. But in this case, I think this works. So I'm just going to click done, and then it'll close us out of our transform tool. And now we do this with the front. So I'll drag this front into the top of our layer so that we see it on top of everything else. I'll click on this. I'll use the L hotkey for our polygon lasso, and I'll go all the way around here. You can see here that this edge is actually bent up a little bit, so we might need to use the warp tool here. We'll see how this goes, but I'm just gonna do my best to follow this edge here, and we can perfect things a little bit more later. We're going to click the inverse button, use the E hotkey to start erasing. It'll warn us, and we'll say, yes, we do want to rasterize this so we can erase it. And then I'll use the right bracket to make the erase big, and I'll just erase all that. I'll click Control D to come out of that selection, use V to be able to select this, and I'm going to zoom in here with the Control plus button. Control minus zooms you out. So Control minus. Control T, I know this is a lot of hotkeys, but it'll get easier the more you do it, will give us our transform tools. And I'll click on this corner up here, and if I want this to scale evenly, I'll hold down Shift. And we'll kind of eyeball it a bit. Maybe I'll drag this edge in a little bit, and then I'll right click on this, distort it. So I'll move this in, and then I'll move out again. You'll see this page is bent a little bit, so we're actually going to need to warp this a little bit. So you can see that gave us a grid. I'm going to grab this point here. I'm going to move it in here. And I'm just going to try to line this up as closely as I can. I'm also looking at the second page because I want to make sure that these green lines can line up, and we might need to make further adjustments in a little bit, but we're getting it as close as we can right now to save us time later. So there we go. I'm going to click Enter so that we come out of that transform and it locks it in that position. Now we're going to need this. So I'll move this up. In the layer hierarchy, I'll use L, and I'm just going to grab this part here, invert it, use the E hotkey, it'll warn us again, and then we'll erase it. Control D to come out of that. We're going to use Control T again for the transform tools. Oh, I didn't erase everything. We'll need to go back and do that. So I'll just get it kind of close, and I'm going to erase this top part. So I just use the T hotkey again. Control T. We're going back into distort. I'm going to grab this corner, drag it in over here. I'll scroll down. We want to try to get these lines to line up, and that's more important right now than this edge up here lining up. So it's a lot of going back and forth. We could even try the warp. So I got these lines pretty close. I'm going to hold down Control. If you're on a Mac, it's Command, Control, Alt, Shift, and E. And that'll make a copy of everything below this layer and make it all one. So you could see that if I turn off everything else, we put everything on one layer that's a copy. You can even use the brush tool, this one here, and use B and then select your color and just kind of clean up areas with this. So that's one way to help get these to line up. You can adjust your opacity here. And you can use the stamp tool, and then choose Alt in order to copy over other textures, and then you can draw the line on top of that. And kind of blend things together. So if you're having trouble matching up parts, that's one way you could do it. I'm going to use the stamp tool here a little bit. And for the edges, I actually took a photo of just the side of a book so that we could use that. And then I can go ahead and select this using the rectangle marquee tool. I'll copy this, Control V, Control Shift V to paste in place. And these pages look a little bit more yellow, so if we'd like to change these, we can drop in a hue saturation and then right-click on this and choose Create Clipping Mask, so that when we adjust the hue saturation settings, we're only affecting this layer. And then once we do that, we can reduce the saturation of this one layer to something like that and brighten it up a little bit. So those are our pages. And then we can use the R hotkey, Control T. Sorry, Control T. R would be if we were inside of Cinema 4D. And then we can rotate this around. If we hold Shift, we can snap to 90 degrees. And then we can just scale this in here. And place it like this. It's okay if it goes a little bit beyond where we need the texture. And then I'm going to copy this. Or actually, I'm going to flatten these two or merge these two layers just so that we have this left over. And then I'm going to copy this and paste it again. So now we have two of these. I want this one to line up with that one on this side. So what I need to do is turn off auto select, Control T, right click, and then we can flip this. So now you can see these match up nicely. And now I can rotate this around and put it here, knowing that this edge will match up nicely with that edge. Now what I need to do is copy this and paste it again. Now we want this one to match nicely with that edge, so we're going to use Control T, and you can also flip it using one of these buttons here. So I'll use the vertical flip button, and now you can see that those line up nicely and are seamless, which is what we want at that edge. So I can move this on over and rotate it around and put it here. And a lot of times, if you just want to make sure that if something goes over the edge a little bit by accident, what you can even do is create another layer and just choose a color close to the book and use the fill bucket. The hotkey for that is G, and just fill in that background. And you can see our background is being covered up because we had made a copy of all those layers. So if we use the magic wand tool to select everything white in here and then delete that, you can see that gray background. I'll just clean up this edge a little bit. So this is our texture. Now we need to save this. And once we do that, we can go ahead and add this to our model back here inside of Cinema 4D. So what I want to do is go back into Standard. I'll create a new standard material, and I'll name this folding book. I'll double click on here. I'll find our texture and I'll just drag and drop the new texture we made into here. And I'll plug that into the color. Place this on here. And you'll notice that it doesn't look very high resolution in the viewport. You can actually adjust that in your settings, but you'll see even though it's doing this in order to save memory and not showing all the detail, if we were to start rendering this, it'll come through as high resolution. So here is our book. I might try a dome light instead of the sky object, just so that you guys can see it. So this edge here is why we really worked hard at making that seamless. And now we have our book that we can add to our bookshelf. So that's pretty cool. So I'll go ahead and copy this into our bookshelf scene. And we can add this right in here on this top shelf. I'll rotate it around. So this is a really fun way to populate your scene by adding in books that look realistic, is by taking photos of books you have around your home and texturing them. You can also purchase books, but the thing that I've noticed is that if you add a bunch of plain books in your scene, it doesn't look as realistic because we're used to seeing titles on books, a lot of interesting textures and shapes. So I find a lot of times in renders, there's a lot of generic looking books and they look fake because they look so generic. So even if you just drop in a few books in your scene that you've textured with a real title or some real designs on it or something like that, it adds so much more realism to your renders, which is why I took the extra time to do that. It's much easier to put plain books in a scene, but that detail really makes the difference between your render being okay and great. So this pretty much wraps up today's episode of adding in the books into our scene. So that was a lot of fun. Thank you for following along. We'll continue working on this project. We still need seating and some tables and things like that. So I'm going to do that next. And hope to see you here next time on Ambient 3D Animations. If you found these tips helpful, please leave me a like or subscribe because that helps me with this YouTube channel continue doing this. And look forward to seeing you here next time.